Welcome back, viewers. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you coming back to this channel and actually watching these videos. And because of your support, this channel is growing. So if you are new to the channel, please do subscribe, hit the notification bell so that when I post, you'll be the first person to know. Just want to put a disclaimer to say the information I share on this channel doesn't represent any of the organizations that I associate with or that I work for. It's information or nuggets from my own practical, experience of working in social work for more than 20 years now. However, I just want to emphasize that the purpose is just so that we invoke some conversations and also offer others who may want to be learning a thing or two from these videos. So without further ado, let me get straight into today's topic really. So today's topic, I'm just going to talk a little bit about cultural humility and discrimination in social work. The way I'm going to be doing it is I'm going to be unpacking what cultural humility and discrimination is. And also I'm going to unpack how cultural humility and discrimination are manifest in social work in the way that we practice with families, and how you can cultivate humility and emotional intelligence in your work so that you can, exhibit some cultural competence, so to speak, really. So, without wasting much time, let's dive into it straight away. So, cultural humility, I will define it as a lifelong process, really, because it's not going to end. Because as long as you're a professional, you are practicing in a certain profession, you need to be mindful of cultural humility. So, for me, it's a lifelong process of self-reflection and learning, and where as a practitioner, as a social work practitioner, you need to be acknowledging your own biases and how they may influence the decisions that you make on a day-to-day basis. You also need to be recognizing the limits of your own cultural limitations, or of your own cultural understanding, where you know that this is, I'm actually out of depth here, I don't understand this culture quite well. You need to be acknowledging that and learn, and also get somebody else who is competent in that area to give you guidance and give you directions, and or even if it means just discussing that case or checking out with that particular person to make sure that you're on track and you're actually doing what needs to be done. Um, as a practitioner, you need to remain open to learning at all given points, because even though I've been practicing for more than 20 years like myself, it doesn't necessarily mean that I don't learn anything from somebody coming from university straight away. I will learn a thing from you, because obviously the fact that I was last formally in a university class 20 years ago, it means that there are things which may have come up over these years which I may not necessarily be privy to. So learning is a lifelong thing, and you need to always remain open to learning as a practitioner. So, unlike cultural competence, it implies the mastery over knowledge, and also cultural humility requires ongoing self-critique. Whereas when we talk about cultural competence, we're talking about you mastering the knowledge of particular cultures and mastering the knowledge of particular sections of the population, so that you know exactly how to engage them. However, with cultural humility, it's about you having an ongoing self-critiquing of yourself, and also active engagement with diverse perspectives, which will actually aid you in the work that you'll be doing. Uh, what it basically means for us who are practicing with children and families, it means you need to be approaching the families and children that you work with in a curious manner, and also in a respectful manner, and willing to learn from them, and also willing to be corrected. It doesn't necessarily mean that whatever knowledge you have gained today, tomorrow it will still be valid. Things, culture is dynamic, so things do change. You need always to be open to learning, and to always be open to self-critiquing yourself as well. So in short, that's what it basically means to be culturally humble. Moving on to discrimination. Discrimination is what I would call a prejudiced treatment or an unfair treatment of individuals based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, religion, gender, disability, and to an extent, socio-economic status or class, what we would call class. That's discrimination, basically. So in social work, discrimination can manifest in both overt and covert ways. What I'm just basically mean by that is sometimes it manifests directly or indirectly. Well, I will also unpack how it manifests indirectly in some of the work that we do as well. Sometimes it manifests through unconscious bias, where you present with some biases in an unconscious manner, or sometimes it does present in an unconscious way where people are actually deliberately coming up with policies that would discriminate particular sections of the society. Or sometimes just putting some systemic barriers or within institutions which might actually prejudice or discriminate against specific people or specific people from a particular race or ethnic background, something like that. Sometimes there is also what we call microaggressions. We need to be mindful of these ones. These are nuances that kind of come up or crop up in our everyday interactions. And sometimes, as people who have been discriminated for a long time, it's things that you actually pick up and see. But for sometimes people who are actually on the other end of discriminating against you may not necessarily be able to pick those. Or sometimes that is if they are doing it in an unconscious manner. But if they are doing it in a conscious manner, obviously it may necessarily mean that that's their intended purpose. They actually intend it to hate the person that they are projecting it to. So that's in short cultural humility and discrimination, really. So next I'm just going to unpack how cultural humility and discrimination manifest in social work practice. Right, so I'm going to focus more on the area of practice where I am currently practicing, that is with children and families. For instance, the first example I'm going to give is with regards to a decision-making bias. What do I mean by this in terms of decision-making bias? As a social worker, you might unconsciously perceive a family's parenting, for example, is neglectful because it differs from the mainstream culture or from the mainstream norms that you know, or it differs from your own understanding of what parenting should look like, not considering the cultural context in which all these things are actually happening. Let me give an example. Physical chastisement. You need to understand, even if the parents are actually saying, yes, I've done it, but has it been done in a cultural context? That's one thing you need to understand as well. In as much as we are saying it's not okay for the parents to be doing that, but you may need to understand that some parents know nothing else other than what they've been taught themselves. So it's about educating them and making sure that they actually understand that this is prohibited and this causes trauma to the children, and give them all the nitty-gritties in terms of why we are saying physical chastisement is not good for children. So that's another way of where sometimes lack of cultural humility or discrimination can actually manifest in social work. So if you are not culturally competent, sometimes you may not actually have an appreciation of these things. But when you are culturally competent, you're appreciating of cultural context in which all these things are happening, you are actually able to swoop in there and actually educate the parents the way they need to be parenting their children, or as expected, really. So it's about also taking that into account, and also having an open and honest conversation about how they've been parented themselves, what influence of the way they've been parented themselves is actually coming into play into the way they are parenting their own children, and the downsides of whatever negative parenting techniques that they're actually implementing at that particular given point in time. So sometimes cultural humility, lack of cultural humility and discrimination, sometimes it also manifests in social work in our own decision making. That was just one example which I gave there. But sometimes decision making can be biased in the sense that top down approach, in the sense that top management may not necessarily be conscious of the numbers in terms of numbers that are being dealt with by the teams. It's such that resource allocation may not necessarily reflect what's on the ground. That's another way where decision making can also be biased because of lack of cultural competence or cultural humility, and to an extent also sometimes it can also be due to discrimination in other settings as well. Point number 2 is about stereotyping. When we talk about stereotyping, we are talking about situations where assumptions are made about a particular individual only because of stereotypes which an individual or a professional holds about that particular ethnic group. For example, assuming that a young black boy is aggressive, and that, for example, an Asian family does not engage with service due to cultural, rigidity, which can lead sometimes to misjudgments. All these are just examples of stereotypes that people may have, which may actually impact in their decision making, which may also actually impact in the way they engage with families. So when we talk about cultural humility, it's about you going in there with an open mind about you learning from them, but also you being able to educate them on what is expected of them at the end of the day. So point number 3, where sometimes it manifests itself as well, is in language barriers, where sometimes social workers do fail to make use of interpreters where these are actually required. So not providing interpretation services can also disadvantage families in a big way, in a sense that those with limited English proficiency may lead to a situation where they may not want to engage with support services, or sometimes they may not even have an understanding of what it is that you are talking about. Or point number 3, sometimes it may lead to miscommunication, and you know what happens when there is miscommunication. Sometimes it means the message is not actually understood as you would want it to be. Or sometimes it can also lead to exclusion, because at the end of the day they just feel, oh, it's for the mother, because the mother is the one who can converse with you in English. The father, if the father can't converse with you in English, and even brought in an interpreter, it means that he feels excluded from the whole process that's which is actually happening. And sometimes also when programs are being put, whether it's on radio or on social media or whatever, if it's not put in a language which they understand or which they can read, then you are definitely excluding them from the mainstream information which is being passed. So that's another point where sometimes cultural humility or discrimination can actually manifest itself in social work. And then point number 4, it's linked to what I've spoken about earlier on. We're talking about institutional discrimination. What do I mean by this? This is where sometimes families from marginalized backgrounds may experience harsher interventions due to what we call systemic biases. What do we mean by systemic biases? For example, overrepresentation of black children in care, or overrepresentation of black youths in the youth justice system. So institutional discrimination, sometimes it can also come into play in that kind of context, because at the end of the day it's also down to the people who are actually supporting that that group of people. At the end of the day, do they have the requisite skills to engage this particular group, or this ethnic group, for example? So that's one other thing also, where sometimes cultural humility or discrimination sometimes manifests itself. Let's talk about microaggressions, point number 5. Sometimes these are subtle comments or behaviors, such as assuming that a parent with an accent is uneducated, or sometimes assuming that because a parent who doesn't own a property may necessarily be poor, for example, or sometimes can make families feel devalued in such a sense that the subtle comments which are made, or the behaviors which are portrayed by people who are supposed to be in a helping profession, or who are supposed to be in a helping situation, sometimes the subtle comments made, or sometimes the behaviors portrayed may lead to that particular individual making silly assumptions about that particular group of people, for example. So we need to be mindful about some of these things. And sometimes, number 6, it also manifests in ignoring lived experiences of the population group that we are assisting or that we are helping. Sometimes dismissing the impact of racism, for example, that's one other thing, or dismissing the impact of trauma on what it is that is presenting now, or what it is that we are seeing now. We ignore the trauma that the family suffered. We're just focusing on, oh, you are abusing alcohol, or oh, there is domestic violence. That may not necessarily help us to deal with the root cause of the problem that we are actually seeing as social workers. So there's something around, taking into account the lived experience of the people, or of the people that we are supporting, or taking into account what we call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences that they may have suffered before they were actually adults. So it's really important for you to be focusing on that, making sure that the family circumstances, are actually fully explored. Because sometimes that can actually weaken the rapport that you can build with that family, and sometimes it can also hinder them from accessing meaningful support at the end of the day. Point number 7 is around lack of representation. What do we mean by this? If services do not reflect the diverse perspective or the diverse lookout of the service users, then it may sometimes families may feel disconnected from the service providers. Sometimes they may also feel disconnected from the interventions that are being done, or it may also mean that they may not value the help that they are also getting from the service providers. So lack of representation is something which is really, really important, because sometimes when decisions are made at a high level by people who don't understand the lived experiences of the people that are being supported, those decisions sometimes are bound to be one-sided, or are bound to be not to be the best, actually, at the end of the day. Point number 8 is about power imbalances. What do we mean by this? Without self-awareness, sometimes you may not actually understand the power imbalance that you hold as a social worker, the power that you hold over these families that we work with. At the end of the day, they may feel that they may not open up to you, or they may agree to do stuff, and then we end up invoking words like disguised compliance. But sometimes it's because we are not explaining ourselves in terms of the power imbalance which is there, or explaining issues around consent properly, where sometimes families may feel that they are actually being coerced to be doing some of these things. So you need to be making sure that the power imbalance is addressed in the beginning stages of your engagement with these families, to make them aware of what it is that they are consenting to make them aware what is it that they are able to say yes to, or things which they can actually say, no, we don't want that, or we are declining with our consent at this point, and explain to them the consequences of all those kind of things, in terms of when they say no to consent, what happens, especially looking at the concerns which we are also having. Right. So we need to be making sure that in the way that we work with them, we are also empowering them, which is gonna go a long way in actually supporting them. So I'm flipping the coin now, looking at how we can cultivate cultural humility and emotional intelligence in social work, or how we can cultivate cultural humility and make sure that sometimes we do away with discriminatory tendencies. Point number 1 is also engaging in continuous learning as a professional. Not only continuous learning, but also continuous self-reflection. I think that's self-explanatory. We need to be regularly examining our own biases, our own assumptions, and sometimes where you've made an assumption without even being picked by the person you're supporting, when you have picked it yourself, you need to be mindful about those things and reflect on it, and actually look at yourself and think what actually made you to make that assumption. Sometimes you get into a property and you assume that the person who is coming to the door is actually the parent, whereas sometimes it's actually the grandparent, or sometimes it's actually the aunt, or something like that. You need to be mindful about what is making you make those kind of assumptions. You need to be reflecting on your own background, and in terms of how it's shaping your expectations, how it's shaping your own perspectives with the families that you're actually engaging with. And you need to also be willing to acknowledge any gaps in your knowledge, because if you don't acknowledge any gaps in your knowledge, you're not gonna fill those gaps with any knowledge, or you're not gonna look for training which will specifically fill those gaps, because you don't acknowledge that you've got those gaps in your own learning. So that's point number 1, and very, very important. And point number 2 is about seeking feedback, from diverse sources, seeking feedback not only from your colleagues, but also from your manager, and also from the service users that you are working with. So be the center of the feedback cycle that you would want. When we are talking about you being the center of the feedback cycle that you would want, we are talking about you being in the middle. We are talking about your manager on the other hand, your colleagues on the other corner, your service users on the other corner, your other professionals that you're working with, multi-agents professionals on the other corner. They all need to be giving you feedback. There's nothing wrong that when you've done a strat, for example, you can actually ask one of the colleagues to say, Can you give me feedback on the way that strat went? Or can you give me feedback on the way this child in need meeting went, or how I chaired that meeting? Or can you give me feedback on how that joint visit went when you have gone with another colleague? So continuously getting feedback helps you as a professional to grow, and it actually encourages colleagues and supervisors and sometimes families to provide feedback to your cultural awareness, which will actually help you to grow as a professional and to be culturally competent at the end of the day. And learning from constructive criticism without being defensive. Sometimes, not everybody wants, criticism sometimes, especially even if it's constructive or sometimes negative. But sometimes you don't need to be defensive all the time when people are actually giving you feedback or are actually criticizing you, because that's how you learn as a professional. So that's really, really important to seek feedback. Sometimes feedback doesn't come to you if you don't seek it. So it's about also you going out of your way to seek that particular feedback, because sometimes people may notice things and may hesitate to tell you or may hesitate to give you that feedback because you haven't asked for it. But sometimes you need to consciously ask for that feedback. So it's really, really important. Point number 3 around how we can, cultivate cultural humility and also emotional intelligence in our work is to educate yourself about different cultures and histories. How do you do this? It's easy these days. There's books. I know many people don't read books, but there's also YouTube. There's also many other platforms, social media, where you can learn lots of things around particular cultures. There's nothing wrong with you taking 20 minutes just to watch a video about even the Muslim faith, for example, about the Christianity faith, for example, about the Jewish faith, for example, just for you to be able to learn those kind of things, or to learn the different cultures of the people who are predominantly in the area that you are working. That is actually going to aid you in your day-to-day work, because you will understand when they say we are going to this function, you will actually understand the value they attach to that particular function, and you can avoid going on that particular day on your visit, or see them day before or even day after. I'm just giving an example. So you need to be educating yourself about the different cultures and histories, or the different cultures or the people that you're actually interacting with. And sometimes it may also need you to be consciously seeking relevant training out there, attending cultural competence training, for example, read books, engage in conversations with people from that particular faith, or sometimes when you have had a case from a family exercising or following a particular religion, and you've got a colleague in the office who also follows the same religion. Have a conversation and find out if fill in all those gaps that you have around lack of knowledge concerning that particular ethnic background or ethnic group, for example. Then moving on to practicing active listening and curiosity. What do I mean by this? You need to be able to listen deeply to what the families are telling you, and also learn about their experiences without jumping to conclusions. And in doing so, you can also do so by asking open-ended questions and avoiding assumptions. Open-ended questions helps you in the sense that they will be able to flowly give you information openly without limitations, where they will give a one-word answer, a yes or no. Sometimes open-ended questions are the best to use, because they will be able to even say more than what you were actually expecting in return as an answer from them. And then moving on to point number 5 is around professionals developing some empathy and emotional regulation. What do I mean by that? You need to be cultivating some empathy by trying to understand the experience from the perspective of the families and the children that you are working with, including colleagues as well. And in so doing, you need to be managing your own emotions around that in an effective way, especially in challenging situations where you were not actually expecting that kind of visit to turn out like that. But you can also learn one or two things from it. And point number 6 is just a reverse of the coin on issues we spoke about earlier, or issues I spoke about earlier on concerning power dynamics. You need to be recognizing and addressing power dynamics. You need to be aware of the power that you hold as a social worker. That's really, really important. And you need to be striving to empower the families by involving them in decision making, and also empowering them by giving them information which will make them be able to make an informed decision around consent, for example, an informed decision around referrals that you are going to be making. Because if they don't have any knowledge or any information about that, they may not be able to make the best decision out of that particular scenario. And you need to be challenging discrimination in all its forms. That is straightforward. I'm not going to expand much on that, but you need to be able to speak against discriminatory policies or practices, even in your workplace. If there is a policy or practice in your workplace which you think is discriminatory, it starts with you to identify it and articulate it and talk about it, to the powers that be or to your online manager, and then it can be addressed in a formal manner or it can be addressed appropriately. And you need to be advocating for fair treatment of your families, even when it comes to utilizing of budgets, or when it comes about you advocating to your manager about doing A, B, C, D for them, even if the answer sometimes is no. It's about you articulating to say, I don't understand why you are not agreeing to this budget, because my understanding is that we need to be helping them with this and this and that and that and that. But sometimes it's not always the case that if a manager says no, you need to be challenging. But sometimes the rationale why they may be saying no may actually help you to actually learn from that and also be able to implement that in your own practice as well. Right. Point number, the last point is fostering inclusive and culturally safe spaces, making sure that when it comes to engaging specific people from specific ethnic backgrounds, you are culturally competent, you are aware of how you can engage them. Remember, there are some cultures where, as a male practitioner, I'm not able to go and engage females in that particular household on my own as a male. I need to go with somebody else, with sometimes a female, so that I can actually engage them, because they're not able to be in a room or to be in a space on their own with a male person helping them without somebody chaperoning them from their own family or from the extended family, something like that. So you need to be mindful about some of these nuances and being able to practice that. You need to be ensuring that the environment in which you work also acknowledges and respects diverse cultural backgrounds. How do we do this? If you talk about Black History Month, for example, how do we practice that? How do we celebrate it at work? Do we do bring and shares, for example? Are you open to sharing or to testing foods from other cultural backgrounds? And when you talk about going into a household, saying there's no food, what sort of food are you talking about? Because you might go in there and you don't see milk in the fridge. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's no food in the house, because maybe that's not part of their diet, so to speak, for example. So you need to be mindful about some of these things where you make assumptions which are not necessarily correct, or you make assumptions which will actually lead you to be making wrong conclusions at the end of the day. With those few words, I hope you've learned something, and thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe, hit the notification bell so that when I post, you'll be the first person to know. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much. Bye bye.